next, we do have Mr. Michael Goldstein, who is the managing shareholder of the Goldstein Environmental Law Firm, president of the Goldstein Brownfields Foundation, co-CEO of Goldstein Height Environmental Redevelopment Partners, a charter member, and the first president and chairman of the Florida Brownfields Association, and original member of the steering committee of the National Brownfields Coalition, and chair of its Public Policy and Regulatory Incentives and Regulatory Partnership Committee. He was involved in the negotiation and enactment of Florida's Brownfield Redevelopment Act in 1997. In 2013, Michael was awarded the Brownfield Leadership Award at the US EPA National Brownfields Conference by the National Association of Local Government Environmental Professionals for his achievement and commitment to public-private partnerships, and the Chrysalis Award by the Florida Brownfields Association at its annual Brownfields Conference for his outstanding efforts for the cleanup and redevelopment of brownfield properties in the state of Florida. And I will hand it off to you, Mr. Goldstein. Thank you.
You're welcome. That was such a great introduction. That probably takes up all of my time. Thank you and good night. It's the end of a long day. A lot of great information presented. I will try and be brief with my remarks. Josh, thank you for Representative McCollum's hard work, and Carrie, thank you for your very hard work within the agency. We just heard some very good insider perspective on what the evolving environmental redevelopment landscape looks like. I'm going to give some outsider perspective, and as you'll see in short order, and I'll go through these slides very quickly, there is considerable overlap, which is meaningful in and of itself because it reflects that both on the inside and the outside of the process, everyone appears to be seeing the same thing, which is policy driving politics, driving equity, driving opportunity. And that's our big takeaway from where we stand today, the vast amount of opportunity that exists to invest in and effectuate environmental redevelopment in a very different way, to use a term the kids love to use, in a disruptive way that provides for more transparency and more equity. Can everyone? Just a brief overview of the perspective that I'm delivering today. I wear a number of hats on the private sector side, on the philanthropy side, but I'm also very much involved in environmental policy at the national level with the National Brownfields Coalition, which is a nonpartisan alliance of not-for-profits, academics, as well as public and private sector professionals who develop and advocate for policies and practices that support the responsible cleanup and reuse of brownfield sites and other forms of impacted land like Superfund sites and wrecker sites and former mine sites and coal-fired power plants, and on and on and on and on. We're involved in promoting existing legislation proposed by others and championed by others. And then we have our own pet projects that we've been working on for some period of time in certain situations over 10 years, like the renewal of the federal brownfield tax deduction, which we started working on sometime around 2008. And just recently, a bill was reintroduced, reauthorizing the tax deduction. It's a very powerful incentive. If these are the kinds of issues and initiatives that you would like to be involved in, there's great contact information on this screen. Okay, briefly and quickly, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, HR 3684. Carrie and Josh did a great job talking about where the legislation currently stands. It was filed back in June 4th, 2021, so it's made great strides, over 33 roll call votes. And of course, this is bipartisan legislation to invest in infrastructure above and beyond environmental redevelopment, with an emphasis on roads and bridges and rail and transit and ports, airports, electric grid, water systems, broadband, and resiliency. I've culled the main environmental pieces of the legislation, as they all could have an environmental redevelopment component, whether you're representing private sector entities, public sector entities, not-for-profits, or NGOs. Obviously, we have thousands and thousands of communities across the country that are host to, at EPA's last count, over 450,000 impacted sites, disproportionately located in minority communities of color. And as Carrie pointed out, there's a Justice 40 initiative to ensure that 40% of federal funding for environmental programs gets to communities that need the funding most. And so what we do with this slide is we start to pull out the major funding pieces that are up for grabs and that we all need to be on high alert for in order to pull resources into our communities. The money comes in at the federal level, and then of course it's absorbed in a very intimate way at the local level. The Act looks to invest $21 billion in remediation. I believe that's a number that Josh referenced. It's the largest investment in history in addressing legacy pollution that harms the public health of communities and neighborhoods across the country, in addition to accelerating redevelopment and public health protection. It provides access to new employment opportunities and ties in climate stewardship. $55 billion for clean drinking water. And then at the end of this slide, we have some of the elements of that $55 billion investment, which again should be tracked for those of us representing NGOs and local governments and other eligible entities for this funding. $10 billion in grant for remediation of PFAS-related chemicals in drinking water and wastewater systems, $11.73 billion for lead service line replacement projects, $200 million, which is a little low in my opinion, to address lead in school drinking water systems, but $14.65 billion for drinking water state revolving fund programs. We're most focused on today the amount of additional money going into the Superfund and the Brownfield programs. And the Superfund side, very exciting. We could spend the next 3 days talking about EPA's Superfund redevelopment initiative and how all of the Brownfield incentives, economic, liability, technical, dovetail nicely, seamlessly into Superfund redevelopment. Obviously, we don't have time. Both previous speakers mentioned $3.5 billion in additional funding over the next 5 years for EPA to conduct remedial actions. Why is that an environmental redevelopment play as well as an enforcement play? Well, it's because EPA, through its Superfund redevelopment initiative, is focused on making sites ready for reuse. So the more money they have to take more sites through the remedial program, independent of a private sector or public sector stepping up to the plate voluntarily, the easier the lift will be for the private sector and public sector actors working on a voluntary basis, the less the funding gap will be. This is historic investment in Brownfields redevelopment through Superfund, in addition to the Superfund remedial budget. What's also interesting about the Superfund side of the funding in the Act is that it waives the state cost share requirement, which lowers the burden on states and, from my perspective, further accelerates long-standing disinvested orphan sites back into reuse. On the Brownfield side, we have an express abundance of riches here. $1.2 billion in additional funding for grants to eligible entities, and then $300 million over a 5-year period separately to states, so states can give out assessment and remediation grants. What's interesting about the $1.2 billion allocation for Brownfield grants is that it creates a bit of a conundrum. It dramatically raises the caps on each individual grant opportunity. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read all of those. They're here on the screen. But what this likely means is that larger grants will not only be made available, but will be awarded to a smaller number of grantee applicants, right? So we have more money coming into the system, into an already competitive environment. But because the grant caps are being raised considerably, the annual allocation, 5 years, $1.2 billion over 5 years, will be absorbed much more quickly by fewer applicants. I don't think that's a policy ramification that's been fully understood yet. It's something that we're struggling with within the National Brownfields Coalition. Clean energy, a major investment on the clean energy side, which dovetails nicely into environmental redevelopment, again, beyond the remaining time available to us to talk about. EPA has a tremendous renewable energy on brownfield sites and former mine production sites that will be supercharged, turbocharged by this $70 billion investment in clean energy and clean energy infrastructure. It's the largest single investment in clean energy in American history. And this slide details all of the specific components of that investment, including the $65 billion for energy and electric grid infrastructure. Closely on the heels of that investment is a massive investment, hundreds of billions of dollars for transit, transit-oriented development, again, a brownfields play, the reduction of emissions, and the increasing of resiliency on a state and local level by financing infrastructure projects that effectively combat sea level rise. Sea level rise is an important brownfields consideration. We'll get to that shortly in a second. In terms of remediation planning, we've spent the past 10 years in the private sector, the public sector, and among regulatory agencies perfecting the use of engineering controls to leave contamination in place and successfully cutting off exposure scenarios above ground and preventing the infiltration of stormwater through contaminated soil, which prevents further exacerbation or spreading of groundwater plumes. What happens, though, when the risk rises from below and not percolates from above? Hopefully, this funding will help us address that policy consideration in a very real way. What I want to do in my remaining time is just re-emphasize some of the policy observations that Carrie made in her excellent presentation. This, what we're seeing here at the federal level through legislation, is not happening by chance. This is part of a very methodical, integrated strategy that started at the policy level when the Biden campaign launched its journey to the White House. And we see all of these components that my panelists and I walk through over the past 30 minutes in their campaign platform. This screen is taken from the Biden-Harris campaign website. And now in this next screen, we see how politics became policy. Similar concepts, environmental justice, economic investment, climate change, all reflected now on the White House, in the White House press room. The American Jobs Plan. This is not only the golden age of federal investment in environmental redevelopment, it's the golden age of environmental redevelopment and environmental justice journalism. I included this article. There are dozens of wonderful articles now being published by the new media, by the traditional media, that underscores the need for this funding and the way in which federal dollars and state dollars and private sector dollars will collaborate and leverage each other to accelerate cleanup and equity and access to economic opportunity that previously hasn't existed really in this country forever. I mentioned previously how the investment in the Superfund remedial program through the reauthorization of the Superfund tax ties into the Superfund redevelopment initiative. We don't have a lot of time to go into the initiative. This is really a placeholder for a very layered set of resources on EPA's website that speaks to Superfund redevelopment generally and the concept of redeveloping Superfund sites from an environmental justice perspective. Carrie referenced several executive orders. Again, she is seeing from the inside what we're seeing from the outside, and that is not just federal legislative action, but politics turning into policy being implemented through executive action via a series of executive orders. Of course, the first executive order on environmental justice was signed by President Clinton in 1994. A follow-up EO was signed by Barack Obama, preparing the United States for the impacts of climate change. And then we have President Biden's first EO, advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government, protecting public health and the environment, and restoring science to tackle the climate crisis. And then most famously, in environmental redevelopment circles, climate-related financial risk. I mentioned earlier that EPA is very much looking at the integration between environmental redevelopment generally, brownfields redevelopment specifically, climate change and resiliency. This is a reissued guidance document that was published in June of 2021. I recommend it strongly to this audience. It will have significant relevance to everything that we've been discussing. I also mentioned that EPA has a very broad-based program to promote the reuse of brownfield sites and former mine sites for renewable energy production. That concept, that emphasis is reflected in a lot of the funding priorities we see in the legislation we discussed. And this document, this guidance document available on EPA's website, is rich in case studies and resources. If that wasn't enough, there are over 31 documents the last time we put this compendium together, which was, I believe, in July of this year. If you're interested in having late night reading, then feel free to email me and I'll send you the latest link. It's over 1,700 pages in relevant documents. And finally, because I'm an environmental lawyer, I can't help myself. These opportunities are important. They're necessary. They're front and center. It's a very unique moment in time with a tremendous amount of money coming through the system, but this is still very risky business. And acquiring and cleaning up an impaired property, whether it's a brownfield site, a state program site, a Superfund site, a RECRA, it's fraught with regulatory risk and third-party risk and bodily injury risk. And thankfully, EPA has put together a spectacular handbook on navigating these concerns from a legal perspective. And so I've included that here as well as a reminder and a prompt to go look for it online. And I think at that point, we are going to conclude the presentation.